First topic is the assembly editor interface.
The interface. Okay, what's the first?
So talk about the catalog and the searches.
Okay, so the catalog is here on the left. It contains everything that is used to build assemblies. So the modules are the software building blocks, and then the assemblies themselves are the wiring diagrams composed of those modules wired together. So you can search the catalog. So if I do a search for OAuth, the first initial search type are for modules, as you can see by these radio buttons. So that's what's appearing here are modules. You can search for assemblies with that, either in the name or description, and you'll see the results pulled up. As you're searching, you're also searching by tags. So these items can have tags associated with them. So if you want to tag some content and then search by tag, you can do that as well. You also have the option to search for text within module fields. So what I can do is something like this. And what's happening is it's pulling up matches within the diagram modules themselves. When I click on this and see, it'll highlight where the match was found. So what I search for are PHP snippets within all of the assembly diagrams. So you can see here, that module contains that content that I was searching for right at the top. And you can also search for text within notes. That one probably won't hit. Let's see if this one does. And with this search returning, you can see the note here highlighted in orange. So it found a PHP text inside this note. Okay, so that's it for the assembly editor catalog.
Any question, anybody? Jump in if you have any questions, okay? Okay, let's talk about sharing assemblies and then saving them.
Okay, so there's the concept of a scope, of course, with these assembly diagrams. So when you save them, let me find one that's a good example. I just happen to know these are private. So here's an assembly that should have been saved as private. So there's a checkbox here where you can control the visibility of the assembly. So for assemblies that are private, you have the ability to share them with other accounts in the system. And the way you do that is from the catalog, you right-click on them, and you can use this option, share with other accounts. And then here at the bottom, you see share settings. And what will happen is this will fill in with accounts in the system. And you can just check it to share it with that account. And you can control whether or not that account can actually make changes to the assembly or not by checking that. So that's it for sharing.
So quick question, if someone did make changes, would those changes traverse to all the other assemblies that are using that template?
Yeah, right now there's no concept of versioning. So
okay.
Each assembly is an individual diagram. So when they make changes, those changes will get reflected. And importantly, anything using that assembly immediately starts, using those changes. So if there's an automation, using that assembly, those changes are applied immediately.
Okay.
So to follow up that question, though, only certain people or certain users will have the right to change an assembly that is being used by our public community. So that's not something anybody would be able to do. You would have to have specific rights, right, Robert?
This is the checkbox that controls that, because if you're not the owner of the assembly, you can't make changes to it. You can only save copies.
Okay.
So this is the magic checkbox that lets another account actually change an assembly that is not owned by that account.
So if I want to just copy paste it as a small part in my bigger assembly project, I can copy paste it and then make changes in my version, right?
Yeah, there's different ways to copy. You can save a copy of the entire diagram.
Okay.
Like here, you can save as a new copy, or you can just take a snippet of it and copy out that portion and paste it.
Okay, that's good.
Like that.
Makes sense.
Okay.
Excellent. Let's talk about you've already talked about tagging. Is there any other thing that you can tag other than what you mentioned?
When you save an assembly, you can tag them here in this box. I think, let's see here. You can also tag them from here by right-clicking. And I think you can do that for modules as well. Let's look here. Yeah. So you can tag, if you have trouble finding things, you can tag them as you need to. So everything in the catalog is taggable.
And can you talk about the community and mine tabs and what they're for?
Yeah. So the community is everything that's made public in the system with public scope. You can create your own content, and that stuff will only appear in this tab. So these will be content that you develop that's not public in scope. You can also see what things you have shared with other accounts through this top level category. Okay.
Yep. Super. Info area. Let's talk about the info area and all the uses of it, and the stream inspector, which I think is related.
Yeah, as you see, this little bottom left area is sort of multi-purpose. Lots of different things appear at the bottom left depending upon what you're doing. It's a help area, so you can click the question mark icons, and you see here at the lower left, you get some help information about that module. As you run these things, I'm going to double click, and I've run this assembly, and now you see the output data, a snippet of it at this lower left, and you see this button where you can open up the stream inspector to view the entire data output by that module.
So this is making a live API call, or it's executing your assembly.
It's executing the modules. This one's using sample data at the top.
So if you execute a module that's at level 5, for instance, it's executing everything up until that module, right?
It depends on what you're doing in the diagram.
Okay.
Find a bigger one, maybe. I like to use this one. So when you're working with these diagrams, you have a choice of how you want to run it. This link at the top right, this execute assembly link, runs the entire diagram. Or what I do a lot is I just double click items where when I'm building these diagrams, like if I just want to run this one to this point, I'll just double click on the background of the module. So I double clicked it and it's running the first one. But now you see it just stopped right here and it's giving me this output from this API call. So you don't have to run the entire diagram. This is pretty important when you're working with pretty big diagrams. Sometimes you just want to run a snippet of it. So you have control over how much of it you want to run. Related to that is you can turn things on and off. And this is handy when you're sort of building things, you're trying out different things. You can right click on a module and you can say disable the execution and it'll go gray. So now that module won't execute. And in fact, that carries through to the module within like automations. So once a module is disabled, it won't execute, period, even in automations. So that can also be handy sometimes.
So this is just like commenting some code.
Yeah, just commenting it out. I can take that and comment it out.
Super.
And there's another option here. Sometimes you want to like turn off bigger portions, so you can disable everything and then do the inverse, which is to turn the fewer of them back on. See how that works? So if you need to turn off a bunch of logic, rather than going one by one, you can turn them all off and then just turn the ones you need back on.
So the whole analogy is that when you build an assembly, it's just like writing code, but you're doing it visually, and you can just kind of work with that in a similar fashion.
Pretty much, yes.
Okay. Anything else on the stream inspector you can think of?
Well, there's two ways to get to the stream inspector. One is with this button, and again, you have to load the modules with data. So the way you do that is you run the diagram. Again, I'm double clicking. So I'm running this. You can use this button here to view it. There's a lot of information in this title bar for the modules. So this icon, the magnifying glass, is equivalent to that button as far as opening up the Stream Inspector. So these modules are pretty dense as far as the functionality. You can mouse over every little thing and get help text as to what the thing is. See, I'm mousing over things, I'm getting information. So rather than having a lot of visual text packed into the module, I use mouse over tooltips a lot to show information. You can get help information through there at the lower left. I can click on the module one time, and you see more options here at the left. And a lot of these are duplicates of other techniques like icons. Like this view output data is yet another way to view the Stream Inspector. Run to here is equivalent to double clicking on the module. This is equivalent to a right click context menu. So these modules have other menus when you right click on them. Again, lots of things are packed into these things. So this option, select this and all items below. When I do that, you see everything in the diagram underneath that thing selected. So I can move it or whatever. So when I single click it, that's equivalent to this option here. Again, there's that disable execution you can use. Come back. This you won't need, and here's the help information. So again, this is just a lot of replicated stuff. But you know, the thing is, there's lots of things packed in here. Here's yet another option, more settings for the module. Again, these are things that are not, you know, that are functional for the module, but they're not wireable. So when I design out a module, rather than making a big module that fills up the screen, if things I think are not needed to be configurable in terms of wiring into the module, I'll use them as these configurable settings. So those always appear as another link at the bottom of the module. And you can see here, these are more options for this HTTP transaction module, things like caching and timeouts and different options about the response results.
All right, so we'll go into the modules more after that. While we're still on the UI of the assembly editor, can you talk about the quick picks in the bottom, Robert, and how you add and why you add things and how you use them?
Yeah, I mean, this area at the bottom, these are the ones I use the most. And in fact, these are the system defaults for new accounts. So this quick pick area is just, it's a easier way to get at content rather than having to go into the catalog. So pretty much anything in the catalog, you can take and drag it into this quick picks area. So I can take that thing and just plop it down here. And now I have it where I could get to it very, very quickly. And you can click on things to remove them if you don't need them anymore. So the same thing, we haven't talked about these yet, but in terms of, I might have to reload. There it goes.
Hey guys, you know, I think this is a question for Robert. Can you just elaborate more on what are quick picks?
Yeah, I'm still walking through them. So these are sub-assemblies in the catalog. So the quick picks is where I can just put things in the catalog and just make them easier to access. So I can take that sub-assembly and drop it here. So now rather than having to find that thing in the catalog again, I can just drag it out of the quick picks immediately. So that's the benefit of the quick picks, because sometimes, you know, navigating the catalog or searching is cumbersome. So it's just a faster way to get to content that you use frequently.
So it's just like a shortcut.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it brings up a point. Now you're logged in as a system admin, and I see that you're making changes to these assemblies. It has an auto save feature. Is it actually saving the public implementation of those assemblies if you're logged in as admin?
It's not saving a public copy. It's saving a private snapshot.
Got it.
You know, we just saw, you know, there was a drop down here, a message that said it was auto saved.
Yeah.
So what I can do is, if I reload see, has been auto saved.
Yeah.
So let me, if I close this thing, let me just reload this tab without saving. So now when I open up that diagram again, it was this one, whoops. Now you get this message, it's asking to restore that autosave. And this is actually handy in case your browser crashes or something happens to your machine and you don't want to lose work, of course. So if you're in the middle of editing a diagram and you haven't saved it, you'll get this prompt when you reload it. So I can get back my snapshot. And this is just a private snapshot. It doesn't mean that's what's being used for executing automations. It's just your editing state of this diagram prior to saving it.
So at this point, if you wanted to make this the public version of that 123 config, what would you do?
I would save it up here. You
would save it up there. So it's an auto save, kind of like in Word when you have all your auto save, versions.
That's exactly it.
Okay, cool.
But it's just one version. It's just the current editing session.
Okay. Raj, did we answer your question about the quick fix?
Yes.
Okay.
So this is Ben. So quick question about versioning. So do we have VCS-like versioning too, where we could revert to an earlier version of this template?
No, there's no versioning at all yet. I know it would be nice. I get asked that a lot. It's just haven't had time to build it. So to do versioning, you have to do it manually. So what you want to do is you want to save other copies and just name them, like give it a date, give it something and just do it manually through naming conventions.
Okay. Yeah, that's what I was about to ask. So could you just do that once? If you were to just say, 123 contact form backup, just so that I have a backup to go back to, would it show up right under that folder, 123 contact form?
It depends if you save it public or not, where it's going to go. You probably want to make it private since it's your private copy. And then it will appear, So it's going to appear underneath here in your mine folder.
Okay.
It'll be listed under here. Okay.
Okay, makes sense. Thanks.
Sure.
All right, we're doing well.
What's the next topic?
All right, so let's talk about modules. Could you pick, just start with maybe 2 or 3 modules that you feel are important, that you use very frequently in an assembly, and then maybe kind of describe how these modules work.
Well, I mean, the modules themselves accomplish, functional work. They're just like big software blocks. So to pick out a few of them, you really need to know which ones to use to solve a particular problem. Of course, the ones you're going to use most frequently are ones that make API calls. So for APIs that don't use OAuth, you use this HTTP transaction module. And if these people on the call should know HTTP and know what these things do. So if anyone doesn't know, please let me know right now and I'll walk you through it. But this should be familiar. I mean, as far as setting headers and choosing your HTTP verb. Does anyone not know what all these things do?
So we can hang up on you? Just kidding. Maybe you can spend just a little time on how to modify that module and what kind of capabilities they will have as far as creating and modifying and version or.
Well, no one initially will have that ability because that's yet another whole thing of training. I mean, maybe down the road.
Okay.
But because they would have to learn the module API. I mean, that's like another day or two worth of training just to be able to build these modules. Because then you have to get into the guts of how these modules work with data. Okay. So, but in terms of the commonly used ones, I mean, I was talking about this one's used for API calls that don't use OAuth, and there's variations. Let's look here under remote data. So these are all the ones that make remote API calls or work with data in some fashion. So here's a variation of the HTTP transaction, which is for doing multi-part posts, which is usually for files or whatever. So there are variations of these, and this is another specialized variation, which is one that knows how to do OAuth, usually through headers. And there's another multi-part version of the OAuth specific. So when you're working with an OAuth API, you have to use one of these modules to send API calls. Usually when usually when working with APIs, you have to build up URLs, and there's a specialized URL builder that handles all the escaping. The good thing about this is you can parameterize things. So you can actually build up the URL from other data and have it come out correctly for being passed to these other transactional modules. These aren't modules, but the commonly used things are being able to take a wire from one point to another in a diagram. This wire connector at the bottom does that. So you can think of it just like it's a logical wire. So I can take that wire from here, put it in that thing, give it some data, give it a name, and then unjoin that thing. And then wherever I want to take that output, I can take it down below and put it somewhere where I need it, like that. So that's how you can avoid spaghetti diagrams, by using these wire connectors from point to point.
And let's say, this is Ben, and let's say hypothetically I want the same output in 3 different HTTP boxes.
Yeah.
In the same template. Can I copy paste that, or do I have to do that each time?
Well, what you would do is you would use a split module to take a single value, which is what this one's doing. What I'm doing here, and I haven't explained this yet, but what this is, a wire is basically one of 2 things. A wire is either one or more XML documents that are called data streams, or a wire is a scalar value like a number or a text. So coming out of this top module is an XML document. So I can view that thing, and here's the XML document. So what I want to do is I want to just take out this 234 value or whatever was entered for the API key. So when I drag that to the split, the editor gives me a choice of what do I want to split on. I can either split on a single value, or I can split on the entire wire and use all of its XML content, whether that's one document or multiple documents. But when I select a single value, it then gives me the choice to select what piece of data I want out of that document. So I want to take that API key. So you ask, well, how do I get that thing to multiple places? And then you would use something like these wire connectors.
Oh, okay, gotcha. And
take it out of that split, and then it's the same value now. It's that API key. And I can take that and drag it where I need it down below. Okay?
So I can add multiple output to this data stream split too, and just have these multiple joins and unjoins for every place that I need that value.
Yeah, I mean, it's not too common where you need to, I mean, sometimes it is for making multiple API calls, but it's not all too common where you need to copy a value many times in the document, sometimes 2 or 3 is typical. But when you do, you want to use a split and then take it where you need it. Okay?
Got it. Thanks.
Let's talk about the Webhook module, Robert.
Let's wait on that until we talk about Webhook triggers.
Let's wait until we let's wait then.
Because that's a big topic, and we need to get them up to speed on the mechanics of this.
Okay, makes sense.
I had a question, guys, related to the XML parsing there. In the case where, let's say you have a little bit more complicated XML document with namespaces and things of that sort, and you want to, it looks like you're doing XPath.
Yeah.
If it gets a little bit more involved, is there a mechanism for that, or will that mechanism handle that?
Well, one thing is any XML with namespaces, you usually want to strip out those namespaces.
Yep.
Just to make it easier to work with.
Okay.
Let me show you some things about. I need a better sample assembly. Let's try this one. That's not a good one. So when you're working with XML documents and configuring these modules, like one way is you can choose the data stream you're working with. So what I'm doing here is I have 2 XML documents at the top. This is doing a union to create two separate data streams. Again, I use the term data stream to represent an XML document. So when you see data stream here, what I'm doing is I'm picking which XML document. So you can see here, this one's source, that one's target. And then you were talking about XPath. So these drop downs will automatically parse out all the available paths for working with that data. You can also use this little magnifying icon to do it visually. So you'll see here, it'll open up the document, and as you mouse over things, elements, it'll flash, and you can choose the XPath that way as well. Sometimes you need to manually edit your path here for like the weird conditions where you need to like choose out the first element. Okay. So you can't do that. It just has to be valid XPath here.
Okay.
Okay.
You're good, Brent?
Yeah, I was just curious. It looks like you put any XPath in there, so that's nice.
It's not exactly any. There's limitations because it's because of the browser XML parsers that's used, okay, and this UI library. So there are limitations. It's not any XPath, but it's the most frequently used portions of it.
Sounds good. Thank you.
And for the exception, you can always write code, right?
That's right. Yeah. So when you can't, if a module doesn't function, if you're working with data that you can't make the module work with, then what you have to do is dip down into code. So you would use these extension modules, and the way I find them quickly is I just search for Java, and you'll see the two available extensions. So the ones for working with data, you would want to use Java probably, and there's lots of sample code and diagrams for showing how to use XML parsers. So the thing is, the system has its own XML parser, and this is sort of another long conversation, but I don't know how much time we want to spend on it now, but yeah. Do you want to just table it for later?
Well, why don't you speak a couple minutes about it since you started the topic?
Okay, so BTD is a very, very fast XML parser. You can look for BTD-XML in Google and find its page and find out about it, but it's unlike any other XML parser out there in that it doesn't create an object graph. It's not like an OO parser. It's more like a string parser. It creates a linear array of tokens. So BTD stands for virtual token description. So it takes an XML document and creates token indexes for like where tokens exist within the XML document. So if you think of a typical XML parser, just to change a single character within the middle of the XML, you typically have to load it into an object graph. You have to parse that XML document end to end. Then you change the character, then you re-serialize that thing back out. And this parser works totally differently. It just parses it into like a character array. And then you can change that one character, and then you're done. You just it's ready to be spit back out. So it's orders of magnitude faster. It's orders of magnitude more memory efficient than other XML parsers. And this parser is what the system uses under the hood for everything. And it's actually a good competitive advantage in terms of reducing hardware requirements, making the system fast. But the thing was, this VTD thing was, the system itself has used many XML parsers over the years, so I had to fit it into the system. And to do that, I had to create sort of like an object level wrapper around this thing. And so when you see this VTD document, that's what that is. It's my private wrapper around that VTD parser to make it easier to work with. So learning that thing is actually pretty much a mirror image of something like a DOM4J or other typical Java-based XML parsers. I tried to make it familiar. So, but the thing is, that's what's best to work with when you're parsing out XML manually through Java code within inline scripts in these diagrams. And really, to learn it, it's not like I have documentation. I can probably emit Java doc from it if I wanted to. I haven't done that yet. Or you can just look at the existing code and figure out how it works. The main difference is when you spit out the XML, you have to commit the changes to the document. Because unlike an object-oriented XML parser, as you're interacting with it, you're not really you're not really making changes to the document in that you can do, like for an example, if you rename a node in a typical XML parser, you could then do an XPath query on that new node name and get your answer back. Well, this parser is totally different. You can't do that. You first have to commit the change before you're able to do other kind of manipulations and queries against the document. So this is like basically the only difference is having to commit changes at certain points before you can get the answer back out of the document, if that makes any sense at all.
No, I think it's a good overview just for them to know that this customized XML parser is really kind of what's being used here, and it is more efficient. And if they need to dig more into it, then we can. But
yeah, I mean, it is special. There's a reason why it was done this way.
Yeah.
It's not that much different from other parsers in the terms of its interface from code, except that you just need to know that there's some differences about it.
This is Ben. I know we are digressing a little bit, but just quickly, so I see that we are using these third-party libraries or even organic dependencies. How do we specify if we want to use, let's say, something that's not in the import statement?
Specify, I didn't hear the last part.
Let's say I want to use another third-party dependency or library in my Java code right here. How do I make sure that that third-party dependency would be resolved? How do I provide that jar or that?
I mean, basically, yeah, we would have to install that on the server.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. That's all I wanted to know.
Yeah.
We can get into details later. Okay.
Yeah. And actually, right now, there's no way for you to upload the jar to be able to consume it. And I don't know if I would provide that capability or not, because we get into, I mean, there's already like almost 300 jars in the system. And then, the worry is, jar dependency collisions.
Right.
I mean, sometimes we do use SDKs, like especially when one that comes to mind is QuickBooks. Some APIs are just basically impossible or very, very difficult to work with through normal like REST API calls. And you basically have to use their SDKs. Dropbox comes to mind. I don't even think they have a REST API. So in those cases, we have to install their jars. Sometimes it's PHP libraries. So sometimes we do install those on the server, and then you can use those SDKs straight from these diagrams.
Makes sense. Thanks, Rob.
Sure.
excellent. So let's move on to assemblies. I mean, you've already been talking about it quite a bit. You've talked about wires. Do you want to talk about the assembly editor guide maybe as a good start for them to know where to look up information?
Yeah, I mean, we'll provide the guide to them. Let me see if I can find it here real quick. We can provide this. This is a sort of like a user guide for the assembly editor. I think it's around 100 pages or so. So this would be like another good source of information of basically what I'm talking about in the training of all the settings. And the most important part about this guide is basically all the recipes, and especially getting down to this section of this chapter 4. It talks about different types of triggers like webhooks and polling. So this is another great source of information that to look at. Okay.
Okay. Do you want to talk about patterns of assemblies? Maybe show a couple different patterns.
Well, I'm wondering. I think I need to talk more about not the patterns yet, but more about the mechanics of.
Okay. Go for it.
So we talked about how you double click and you actually have to load data into these things. So let me actually show you what it's like to build a diagram. Let me look at, where's my sample loop? So one thing is that there's no circular logic in these diagrams. Everything flows top down. So how do you do iterative processing? Well, you use loop modules, and there's different varieties of these. This is a basic loop. And what happens is you can nest content within the loop. So, when you first drag it out of the catalog, it's going to be empty. And then what I can do is I can take some content, and not everything's compatible with these, but it'll let you know what you can put in here. So I can configure this to process data, these data rows. So I'm going to double click it. And now I'm going to choose what things to put together. So what I'm going to do is, if you look here, this module modified itself. So out in the wild, it works with whatever you type in, like A, B. So when I look at the output here at the lower left, you'll see the text concatenated together. But when it's within a loop, it doesn't know whether it's a data path or literal text. So to tell it it's literal text, you need to precede it with a $sign. And this is common behavior to all nested items within a loop or other modules that support nesting. So if I do that, so what I'm doing is I'm typing in some literals. So I'm taking the output of the X path and then appending some text to it. And now you can see the literal text I typed in. The first character is coming from the XML. So does everybody see how that worked? I took the XML, then I appended literal text to it.
That was cool.
Is that clear?
Yep.
So the thing is, you can also nest subassemblies within these loops. So that lets you do bigger chunks of logic. And we haven't talked about subassemblies yet. That's what I'll get to next. So like I take this subassembly, plop it in there. And now I'm performing all of this logic on those data rows. Okay. So just to hop into the discussion of subassemblies, a subassembly is sort of like a nested diagram. And we haven't talked about these modules yet, but there's different varieties of parameters you can have. So if you look here, this module has 4 parameters it asks for, and those are coming from these specialized parameter modules up here at the top. So these parameter modules are used throughout the system in different manners. I'm showing you one way, which is as a input to a subassembly. And here in the catalog, underneath modules, I'm going into input parameters. And you can see here they're basically like UI controls. So you can have checkboxes, you can have even drop downs, different types of UI controls that will appear as parameter for these subassemblies. So the other thing is that these parameter modules also control configuration of triggers and actions in the automation editor back over here. So, and that's why these things appear in green. So colors are used very sparsely in these diagrams. Basically everything's either gray for a module, it's either blue for a subassembly, or it's green for a parameter. And that's pretty much the only colors that are used. So these parameters are special and they're used in different ways, and that's why they're green. Okay. So the subassembly, you'll see there's 2 extra modules. The first one is the input at the top, and the other one's the output at the bottom. So the subassembly can take either parameters wired in, or you can pass it XML documents, and you can basically use this module as a way to provide sample data for building your subassembly. So you provide some XML content here and then build out your logic. And then whatever you wire as the output is what's emitted. And that can be either one or more XML data streams, or it can be just a literal value. Okay.
Why is it important to have input and output modules in SubAssembly? That's a prerequisite, right?
Yeah, they're required. And that's, there's certain modules that are used as delimiters when items are saved into the catalog. So like with triggers, you have to have a trigger module. And when you say that thing, it knows it's a trigger. And this is the case with subassemblies. When it sees that module, either one of these, if you try to save it without the other, it'll let you know you can't. And when I save this diagram, you can see it chooses subassemblies because it knows it has those modules in there. So certain modules are used as, like I said, delimiters to know, or sentinels, to know what kind of assembly type is being created.
Very cool. Anything else about sub-assemblies you want to talk about before we look at actual assemblies?
Well, you can, these things can be nested. You can have sub-assemblies that invoke other sub-assemblies. The purpose of them, obviously, is to, have modularized logic. It's to control the size of these diagrams. You don't really want to build out really huge diagrams with, I would say, more than 50 modules. That's a lot. Wherever possible, if you start getting diagrams that big, you really want to look and see where you can just create a subassembly from a portion of that logic just to make the big diagram smaller, okay? So that's a couple of reasons why, situations where you want to use subassemblies.
And these diagrams essentially at the core are XML documents.
The diagrams themselves?
Yeah.
Yeah, these entities, what you're looking at on the screen itself is stored in the system as an XML document in the database.
And can sub-assemblies be shared between two different templates?
Yeah. Yeah, they're reusable. So in your catalog here, there's a section for sub-assemblies. So wherever you need to use that functionality, you can use them in other diagrams.
And you could put your sub-assemblies in your quick picks if you want to use them frequently.
Right. You can plop them down here. Okay.
Awesome. Okay. All right, we have just a little bit of time left. So I'm thinking maybe we can just kind of look at assemblies, and maybe you can describe the service assembly, a trigger assembly, and then the action assembly, and how they relate to the automation editor. And then we can look at the anatomy of a couple of them.
Yeah. So just very quickly, everything in the automation editor is built here in the assembly editor. So the first thing you have to have in order to interact with an API is a service assembly. And I use the term service, it's interchangeable with app. Like, the catalog calls them apps, but they're also called services. There's different varieties of the service assembly, and that's all depending on the requirement of how do you authorize access to the API. The easiest case is where you don't need access at all, like a RSS feed. So here's one for CNBC. And all this service assembly has to have is a module that says no credentials needed. And then you just save that thing. So when you save a service assembly, this dialog is a little bit different. You have to choose a big icon for it that'll appear over here in this automation editor. And you have, you can see here it's forced to be an app category. And you can even give it another subcategory. So this is basically how the thing will appear in the catalog over here in this catalog. And also in our website catalog as well. So that's like the easiest type of service assembly. The next easiest are ones that just use like an API key. 123 contact form does that. And this is sort of like a pattern of how do you want, the pattern is you want to, let the end user enter the API key. You want to validate it. You want to check for errors. And if there's no errors, you save it into the database with this module down at the very bottom for saving the service credential. So that's what this service assembly does. So once you have that created, then you can build triggers and actions. So here you can see it's using the corollary, which is to get the service credential out, and it's fetching that API key that was stored in the database. And this trigger is making an API call. This particular one's looking for new forms in 123 contact form. So it's making the API call using that API key. And I guess we'll save that for a little bit later. Let's look at another variation of a service assembly. And that's for OAuth. I think 500px does OAuth. So this one's using version 1.0a of OAuth. There's this module here. All these things are configured based upon their documentation. The thing about OAuth service assemblies is you have to have the API keys. So there's these key vault modules, and these are getting out the API keys from encrypted database storage. So the key vault is sort of like an area where you keep all your API keys together. So I can go to the key vault menu, and since I'm the system admin account has all the baseline API keys for all the apps, the OAuth apps in the system. So I can export and import all of these API keys as a bulk. So when what's happening here is that key name is being fetched out of that key vault, basically, for that value, the consumer key and the consumer secret. And it's being used for doing the OAuth handshaking during the workflow to authorize access.
And these are the API keys that we had to register for APIANT.com, essentially.
That's right, yeah.
And so when we have a new user that uses their own AIP server, Internet Integration Professionals, and they have their own domain, they have to re-register all these keys with the services that they want to use to work with their server and their custom domain.
Yeah, let me actually show you the document. So what we give them this empty key file, and this is what's being imported into the system, and it's just all these client IDs and secrets. So you basically go register them at these APIs, you fill in the values, then you import that into the system. So when we need to add new OAuth endpoints, new apps, we have to modify our key vault files, to add that app, and then we have to be able to, import that. So the thing is, usually the OAuth keys are specific to a domain name, so we end up having to have multiple registrations for development and production. So that's another little twist. But we have separate, basically, key vault files depending upon whether it's like for our production server or not, or for development.
Okay. So that was services with API with OAuth. Sorry. Okay. Yeah.
And that's pretty much the main variations are, it's either API keys of some sort or OAuth. You do get into some APIs that are session-based or token-based, where you actually have to fetch a token on the fly in order to make calls, and sometimes that's a little tricky in the sense that sometimes those tokens are not, like multi-threadable. You can't use the same token across at the same time across multiple API calls. So sometimes you have to do mutexes, which the system does have. So again, sometimes there's lots of little variations to these patterns, but the system does have a lot of support for those patterns. It's just a matter of knowing what the situation is and working with the API. I'm trying to think which one was doing that. I think it was Infusionsoft. Let me think. Yeah. Here you can see the Infusionsoft API was the one that is not, you can't make an API call using the same token at the same time. So what I did is I wrapped it with a mutex. And then this SubAssembly is what fetches the token. So this is like a really oddball case, and it was kind of hard to discover this until we actually hit the problem. But
so do you actually have multiple tokens in like a pool?
Well, they're being,
or like,
in this case, the token was being fetched at runtime. So it's not being pooled. It's just what I'm doing is I'm protecting the fetching of it with a mutex, so that I get back. And basically, I'm making that API call atomically. So, and in this particular one, it's being done just in raw code. This Infusionsoft was really hard because they're using XML RPC. It was easier to do it in this manner with code.
Okay. So you're using mutex to keep a lock on a particular token until it's used and dispensed.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So basically, everything related to that had to happen atomically. Yeah.
Makes sense.
That's really like the oddball rare case. I mean, you can do a search here and look for mutex and let's see how many places it's used. And this is another way, like when you need to know how a module is used or a good way is by looking for it in the catalog, right-clicking on it, and finding all the assemblies where that thing is used to find you some usages. And you can see here, it's only used for Infusionsoft, basically.
So, I mean, that is a good transition real quick before we get into triggers and actions, which is, when you identify or when you study an API documentation and you see, certain technologies that you need to use, you can actually use this tool to see, have we ever used this before and in what assembly? So you can probably study the assembly and perhaps even use it as a template by making a copy of it, right, Robert?
Yeah, we've hit so many varieties of APIs. There's a good chance that, there's already something close to it in the system. The trick is knowing that to be able to find it. Because there's already over like 250 apps integrated. So it could be, a little tricky to know what's already in the system without, taking a look.
And you can obviously ask Robert. I mean,
That's usually the best way.
he has a search on his forehead. So let's talk about triggers and actions, and I think we'll be pretty much out of time. So you want to kind of pick a trigger?
I can't cover them in the time that we have.
I know, but let's just quick. You got 10 minutes to do an overview of triggers and actions, and just do as the best you can with it.
Yeah. So the quickest one are actions. They're very easy. They're easier than triggers. So an action will have an action module at the top. This is defining the inputs into the action. So this one is uploading a photo to 500px. So it needs the photo URL and a title and a description for the photo. And then basically it's just a matter of making the API call to perform that action, which is happening here. This is uploading the photo through the Multipart post. So the main thing about an action is after making the API call, just checking for an error, spitting out a good error message for the end user in case something happens. So usually this is the way I do it. I take the API response, I look for an error condition, and if I match on the error, I'm using a text builder to build up something of a prettier error message. So that's a basic technique. The other thing about an action is you can have an action output. So over here in your automation editor, you can chain actions 1, 2, 3, and you can take the output from preceding actions and send them to subsequent actions. So those outputs are defined by this output module. In this case, it's being entered by hand. It's just a single URL to the uploaded photo. But you can also emit output dynamically. And there's different ways to do it. You can parse it out. In fact, I just did it the other day. Let me see here. This is for CM Telecom, and this is for, what did I do? It's for validating a phone number. It's a pretty cool API. So I make the API call, and then what I did was I actually wrote a new subassembly yesterday to parse out the information dynamically. So I'm parsing out the output from that API call, and then what I did was, at the very bottom, I just told it to use that parsed output. And what I do is when you run this diagram in the editor, you can get an initial set of fields so that the end user doesn't have to run the action themselves when configuring the automation. And again, like I said before, if you mouse over things, you get a lot of information about these modules. So this is talking about the purpose of this dynamic output field at the bottom here.
Good, and then we'll dive into those more in the next session, but we're going to be calling those, by the way, super actions, just so the user knows that this action will emit data to the next action. So that's going to be a little, just a little marketing thing for us. And let's spend the last 6 minutes to talk about triggers, Robert, just to make sure we cover them.
Yeah, a very basic trigger is usually for new or updated information. And then you have different varieties of triggers like polling triggers and webhook triggers. This one is a polling trigger. This one's making an API call to fetch new followers in 500px. So the main thing about a trigger is this magic module, which determines, in this case, which items are new. So this one stores these identifiers in the database, and the next time the poll is made and the API call returns new results, if those identifiers are not already in the database, they must be new. And that's what gets emitted by this module, are just the new ones, not in the database. And then the last thing a trigger will always do is use this trigger module to emit the mappable output data fields. And there's different ways of doing this. This one's just typing it in by hand, but there's also ways to do it dynamically. Again, what you can do is search for dynamic in the catalog. And there's a module here which will parse out the fields from the API response automatically. And then you just configure it to use that and provide the default ones down at the very bottom here again.
And just to put things in context real quick, so a trigger for an app would be, you know, as far as the automation editor user understands it, is for something that happens in the app to trigger a set of actions. And so a list, being able to pull up a list from an API is always a good way to find triggers, because if you can actually fetch a list of users or transaction in an API, you can compare it to our database, and that's how you're going to be able to know if there's a new item that can fire up the automation.
Here's another very common pattern, which is a trigger for updated data. So there's a technique to do this. What you want to do is you want to use a loop and go through every data response row. And what you want to do is you want to take the identifier, the unique identifier for that data row, and append the last modified timestamp to it. So I'm forming a key that represents when that data row was last updated, and then that's what's being stored in the database. So the way that works is when that data row identifier gets that updated, it'll have a new timestamp, and so that thing won't exist in the database. Hence, it must have been modified, and then that's what gets output by that module. Make sense?
Okay, I think we'll spend the next session really kind of diving into triggers and actions, but I think that's a good overview, so they can understand how these things are constructed.